So we're going to talk about some common tree issues in the Texas Hill Country. I kind of focused on what I've been seeing lately, just because there are so many. But definitely feel free to ask questions throughout and let me know what y'all have been seeing, because I know y'all go out and see a lot of different stuff. So when looking at a tree, right, we want to diagnose what problem it's having. There's a kind of process that, you want to go through to get to that diagnosis. So first identifying the tree, because that's the host or the problem, and certain pathogens or insects will only attack or infect certain species. So that's step number one, is just identify what species we're dealing with, or multiple species we're dealing with. And then look for patterns throughout the landscape. So what do you notice across when you stand back and look? Is it multiple trees? Is it one single tree? Is it different species? And then examine the site, like where the tree is growing. Are we in an urban environment next to a sidewalk and foundation? Are we, on a rocky upslope on a hill? And then examine the roots and the root collar. So looking for girdling roots, any issues that we see at the base of the tree, because that's where a lot of issues can enter a tree. And then taking a look at the trunk and the branches. Do we notice anything going on, on top, or coming apart or anything like that? And then the foliage, so looking at the leaves. So a lot of times, I get calls, emails, the leaves are just turning brown, what's going on? And so instead of focusing on the leaves, you need to take a step back and go through all these. No, there we go. Okay. So different stress factors. So we usually break them up between abiotic, non-living factors, and biotic. So abiotic can include nutrient deficiencies, just where the tree is growing. That usually comes to play when people plant a tree that's not really meant for that site. We say right tree, right place. And that just means, examining the site and then picking the tree, not going to the nursery and picking out your favorite tree and then figuring out where in your yard you're going to plant it. Easier said than done. I fall victim to that as well. So, planting like a magnolia tree here, you're going to run into nutrient deficiencies and see leaves that are yellowing, because that is an East Texas and even more Eastern species that doesn't really grow, out here in the hill country. Climatic extremes, obviously we're dealing with drought. We've dealt with a couple of bad freezes and winter storms. Soil compaction, definitely around like construction, new builds, urban environments. Air pollution, chemicals, herbicides, underwatering, overwatering, and then wounds, whether that's mechanical or due to storms and stuff like that. And then biotic issues, we have fungi, bacteria, viruses, parasites, insects, animals, all that kind of stuff. And this is one of Dr. Apple's slides. He breaks out all these different tree diseases in Texas, and it's just an interesting slide with abiotic issues, so those non-living, the foliar issues, and then issues that occur on the branch and the trunk, and then the vascular issues and pathogens, the root rots, and then the non-issues. I'm not going to cover all of these tonight. So for a disease to occur, you need to have three things present, and that's the pathogen, so the disease, the host, so the right species for it to exist on, and then the right environment. So I'm not going to talk a lot tonight about certain issues that show up after a lot of rain or a lot of moisture, because we haven't had a lot of that. And so, you have to think about the environment. Could this possibly be present with the current conditions? And they might, someone might be overwatering to where there is, those more moist conditions. But all these three have to be there for the disease to occur. So you remove one and the disease is not possible. So what is killing my tree? That's, what I typically deal with on a day-to-day basis, a lot of emails, and I'm sure y'all get that as well. And so typically there's not just one right answer. So if you have a really healthy tree plus an insect like wood borers, you're not going to get a dead tree. But if you have a healthy tree that goes through drought and then a storm, and then there's a fungus involved, and then another drought, and then maybe insects start attacking the tree, and then another fungus, and then you'll get a dead tree. So I get pictures of like just the exit hole of a wood borer a lot, and they're saying like, this is killing my tree. Sometimes that might be the case, but typically there's other things going on to get to that point of the wood borer. And so we break up different pathogens and issues into primary and secondary. So primary issues are things that can kill a tree, and that's the one thing. And so the most common one that we deal with is oak wilt. And then you've also probably maybe heard about emerald ash borer. And so that is a wood borer. Currently it's in Northeast Texas, and we monitor for that yearly to see where it's spreading. So I put out EAB traps in San Antonio and some in Kerrville and Bernie, and we haven't found any so far. They also have not been found in Austin. So it seems like it's not moving, this far south, but that could be a big issue. Especially because ash trees are very popular to plant in urban centers. But that's primary pathogens. So it can take a perfectly healthy tree and kill it. But most issues are secondary. And so the big one, this year is going to be drought and then an issue. So something weakening the tree and then another issue coming along. And so this is kind of pictured with this tree decline spiral. Who's seen this before? Oh, good. Okay. So this is the tree decline spiral. So it visualizes, what can happen to a tree going through decline. And so who's heard like oak wilt and oak decline used in the same kind of sentence and meaning? Does anyone? Oak decline, oak wilt, they're not the same thing. Decline can happen to any tree. And you can specify oak decline if it's an oak tree, but that's not a specific disease. And so decline is just this general diminishing health in a tree. And so you have this outer ring, which is the predisposing factor. So that might be the planting site, climatic variations, and then you can get the inciting factors. And that can be like defoliating insects, droughts on there, frost, different things. And then you can get contributing factors, and that's where you get the wood borers, the fungi, things like that. And so, over a long term, if you just see an exit hole from a wood borer, you have to zoom out and kind of imagine all the things, all the history that could be happening to that tree to get it to that point of decline. Any questions so far? All right.
Question. So I want to get ahead of the ash borers. So what do? When you see it spreading, say, okay, you just log it down, or you actually do something to try and stop it?
Yes. Oh, repeating the question. Jeff asked if with ash borers, if you know that it's in the area or if it's coming, like what can you do preventatively? And so in Northeast Texas, they are having quarantines where you can't move firewood. So we don't want to just easily travel those EAB to a different place. So there's, things like that. There are injections, like insecticide injections to the tree. But unfortunately, like their populations are just going to keep growing. The hope is that the heat as we get further south into Texas will keep them from coming this way. But, they originally thought that oak wilt wouldn't, come to Texas because it's so hot here. So, I hope it stays just up there. Because I'm already pretty busy with oak wilt. So hopefully we don't get EAB as well. All right, so common secondary, anything else? All right, common secondary issues. So again, these are, once the tree is weakened or stressed, then these other issues can come in. So the most common is hypoxylon canker. Who's heard of hypoxylon canker? Okay, good. So this is a fungus, and it actually changed its name, but I feel like everyone is just going to keep calling it hypoxylon. But it's caused by a fungus, Biscogniaxia actropunctata. So if you see that, this is the same thing. But it infects the sapwood, and then it causes the bark to slough off. So you have missing bark, and then it exposes those spore mats. So that top right picture is a more fresh spore mat where it has like brown powder. And if you were to like run your finger on it, you would have like fine brown powder. So it can be wind dispersed. And then as it dries out over a couple months, it kind of turns more into that grayish on the bottom right. And then it can even turn like a black if it's been there a long time, like the picture on the left. But this is a fungus that's kind of theorized to be just around, like in most trees, just waiting for that tree to be weakened or stressed to invade. So it is pretty common. And then when we get a drought, and we're, you know, still in this 2-year drought, that low moisture content makes it easier in the tree for the hypoxylon to take hold. So seeing a ton of this right now in live oaks and post oaks mostly is what I've seen, and then also red oak, so like Spanish oak and bur oak. So if you see it, and I have a huge Spanish oak, we just bought this house and it's this big Spanish oak, and I always tell people, you know, they're not as long lived as live oaks, they're weaker, they break, they rot easier, and now I have to like tell myself this. And so like 3 major branches have hypoxylon now because of the drought. And so if it's on just some branches, you know, you can prune it out, and you're mostly pruning it out for, you know, to try to reduce spread in the tree, but really because that branch is going to become brittle and could break. Yes.
Use the word printing it out.
Pruning, sorry,
I'm
pruning.
sorry. Okay, I didn't hear it. Sorry.
Pruning. So you could try pruning out those branches that have it, which I'm going to try because half of the tree is still healthy. But if you're seeing hypoxylon, you know, on the main trunk, the main branches, you know, it's really not a good sign, because it's kind of one of those things that come along at the end of a tree's life. Let's see if I'm missing anything here. You know, there's no like cure or treatment for hypoxylon, so really prevention is key, and that's, you know, maintaining tree health, which we could, you know, have a whole nother hour talk about maintaining tree health, but, you know, properly taking care of it by properly pruning, watering, all those things.
A question. So this affects all oaks or
And hardwoods, yeah.
hardwoods? So all hardwoods.
So repeat the question.
Oh, sorry. Does this impact just oaks, and it can impact other hardwoods as well?
Okay.
That's just what I see it mostly on. Okay, another thing, this was last year in San Antonio, got a call. This is a Spanish oak. And so in the red oak family, and they were concerned about oak wilt and wanted me to take a sample so we could verify if it's oak wilt. And if you know a bit about oak wilt and red oaks, the main symptom in red oaks is that branches just turn brown at the wrong time of year, turn reddish brown. And so this was, I think, like August or July. And so we shouldn't be getting fall color yet with this tree. And it could be oak wilt because oak wilt moves through red oaks, you know, branch by branch very quickly. So it could be a matter of weeks, where we call it flagging, where branches just flag, they change color until the whole tree has been infected and died. So I was going to sample it, but, you know, I walked up and I noticed the oozing cankers, which is that picture on the bottom left. And so that's not typical of oak wilt. So then I start, you know, with my hatchet and my chisel, removing some of the bark, and there's a lot of powder. And then I found that little guy, which I circled there. And then I pulled it out with these little tweezers, and that was a flathead borer. And so these borers attack weakened and dying trees. Again, you can kind of see a theme here. The larvae tunnel into the sapwood, and that girdles the cambium and the phloem. So that cuts off their nutrients and their water. And then you can see those oozing cankers on the outside. And sometimes that takes a while. So you're not going to see that immediately. But they'll definitely show up if there's enough of them. And so there is insecticide that you can inject, but you have to, you know, be quick to do that before the infection is really spread throughout the tree. Otherwise, again, maintaining, you know, tree health, tree vigor, so that these kinds of insects can't really take hold in the tree. All right. And then this one, this is, can I exit out of that? Okay. So ambrosia beetle. So I got a call pretty recently after the 2021 winter freeze, the Uri storm, the bad one. And this was in a neighborhood where we know there's some oak wilt, but it was kind of removed. And this huge, large live oak had just turned brown leaves. And brown leaves in live oaks for oak wilt is not very common, and it can happen. But the leaves had just turned brown and didn't really see much. So I went back later, and then this frass was evident. So this powder in the crevices of the bark was there. And so that indicates ambrosia beetles. And so these are tiny, tiny little beetles that are attracted to stressed trees. So trees, release ethanol when they're stressed. And these kinds of species are adapted to going towards that smell. And then they mass accumulate these beetles. So they're super tiny. There's a lot of them trying to attack the tree. And they make tiny holes, and then they also create galleries where they tunnel through the sapwood, the cambium of the tree, which also kills it. But then they kick out, push out the frass, or looks like sawdust. And so that is what was evident. And then once we saw that, we removed the bark, and then there's these tiny exit holes. I mean, you can barely even see them. They're so tiny. But that frass was the indicator. Now, if it rains and washes all that frass away, that's one indication that, you might not see. And like I said, I had to go back to this site, so it wasn't apparent right away. Let's see if I missed anything. There can be several life cycles that can occur in that tree in a year, but then the adults will fly off in search of a new host tree. So if you have a high infestation in your tree, it's advised to cut it down so that if they were to fly off and you had more stressed trees, we don't want that to happen. And then another tree dies. So again, I saw two scenarios like this after the big 21 freeze. And then this year, again, I was called and asked to take a sample. And there was even some leaves with veinal necrosis, that top picture. So that's where the veins are necrotic or browning, which is typical for oak wilt when oak wilt is in a live oak. But most of the leaves, again, were just brown. And so I started digging into the tree, and then again, I found all that frass. And so, 2 years of drought, or this was like a year and a half into the drought, and we found this too. So those things can come about, with those extreme events that stress the tree. And, for this one, I'm not just thinking drought, I am thinking the winter freeze, then last year's freeze, now last year and this year's drought, right? So all of that stuff is cumulative, just like that decline spiral. Any questions on?
So is there something that you can spray on? You got a really nice big tree you don't want to lose. Is there anything you can spray on the top or the bottom 8-10 feet to help prevent some of this stuff?
So the question, thank you. The question, I'm learning. Yeah. The question was, can you spray anything like on the lower trunk to prevent ambrosia beetles? Not really. I mean, it is still fairly rare. I haven't seen it a ton, but again, it's just, you want to prevent it by, keeping those trees healthy. And, I think I might talk about this a little bit, towards the end, but if you have that big live oak in your front yard and we're expecting a cold snap, actually watering that tree before the cold snap to insulate the cell walls can actually get the tree through that freeze better. Things like that are, obviously watering during drought, not wounding the tree. So ambrosia beetles can enter through, a big wound. So if you improperly prune your tree, or if you're, clearing an area of your property, with like a dozer or something, and you rip into that live oak, all those sorts of things you want to try to avoid. Yes.
I have two questions from chat site. First one is please expound on stress factors such as parasite flowering plants on trees.
Ball moss.
Expand on flowering parasite trees. So that's like mistletoe.
Mhm.
So mistletoe is a flowering plant, but it's also a parasite. So it's a hemiparasite because it can photosynthesize and make chlorophyll and make its food that way, but it's also taking the nutrients and the water from the tree. So things like that.
Okay, and then the second question was, are ash junipers susceptible to wood borers? Many of mine are slowly dying.
I haven't seen a ton of wood borers on junipers. There's definitely species out there that can bore into them. What I've noticed with, and I have a picture right here of a juniper that just turned brown due to drought. So I do get this question in drought years. And there's really just not a lot that kills these trees besides really bad environmental conditions. So you can get like spider mites, things like that. Typically that's not gonna, kill the tree necessarily, because if there's spider mites, there may be other stress factors at play. And so typically it comes down to environmental stress for our ash juniper.
I have I have noticed when I've been going, I've been west,
Mm-hmm.
and I think it's just past Sonora, where if you look to the south, there are huge areas where the junipers have just died.
Mm-hmm.
So I imagine part of that could be because of drought years that we've had. But are spider mites a big issue for the junipers?
So the question was going west towards Sonora, seeing a ton of ash juniper dying off, turning brown, and are spider mites a big issue? I really don't see spider mites a lot. I don't get calls or emails about them a lot. From extension agents, I don't hear about it, because we talk and, shared questions and what we're seeing. And so personally, I don't see a lot of damage via spider mites. If you have a different experience, I'd love to hear about it though.
Okay, the last question from the same individual says, should ball moss be removed from trees?
I will talk about ball moss.
Okay, good.
Okay. Good questions. All right. So, I keep talking about drought, so let's just talk about it for a sec. So, what we're seeing is, throughout this summer, a little bit last year, our leaves wilting or turning brown already. Early leaf drop to conserve resources. So just because a tree has dropped their leaves doesn't necessarily mean it died, but that is a way for them to conserve energy. So trees transpire water a ton. They really only keep, maybe 5% or less of water that they uptake. They're losing a lot of that water. And so if they get rid of the leaves, they're getting rid of where they lose all their water through transpiration. And so they can drop their leaves early to try to conserve that energy, conserve that water until there are more favorable conditions. And so that's something that we're seeing too, and more on that on the next slide. But another impact of drought is there's less water available for the tree. So that means the tree can produce less sap. And sap is kind of that natural mechanism that trees have to push things out. Those insects trying to bore into them. If sap can push them out, they're not going to enter the tree. So less sap. And then you also have stressed trees releasing more chemicals like ethanol. And so those things are attracted to them, like I said. And all of that means, more opportunities for all these secondary issues to occur. And so I put this little graphic up that our communications department made. But, one way, if you do have a tree that dropped their leaves, is testing, some twigs on all the major branches. And so try to bend it. If it's bendy, that's good. It has some elasticity. If it's brittle and breaks and it's drying out and dead, if you scratch it with your thumbnail and it's brown underneath, like the picture on the left, that at least that part of the tree is dead. If it's green and nice and white live wood underneath, then that's alive. So that's one way to, to try to test your tree if there's no other major obvious issues. And then I've gotten tons of calls this year, specifically about red oaks, Spanish oaks, saying, I think my tree has oak wilt, it's turning brown. And then we also have even live oaks, like that picture on the right, kind of exhibiting oak wilt symptoms. And so it can get, when we are in these extreme droughts, you can get, mimicry with oak wilt symptoms. And so you have possibly that veinal necrosis. You can see where the veins are kind of yellowing, even turning brown in some of those. You can have tip burn, which just means the tip of the leaf is turning brown. You can have marginal necrosis, which means the edge of the leaf is turning brown. All of those are symptoms of oak wilt, but they can also show up in extreme drought. And then in red oaks, like I said, if they're just dying off quickly, that's usually people's like light bulb that it could be oak wilt. And so I've gotten so many calls about this, again, specifically about Spanish oaks. And so you really have to, kind of dig deeper, see if you can figure out more details. So is there a pattern of mortality? And that means, in oak wilt, especially in live oaks, once an infection center starts, we have that movement through interconnected roots. So from tree to tree, it slowly moves about 75 feet per year on average. So do we have on the site, do we have evidence of an old dead tree, what I call skeleton trees, and then newer dead trees where you have the fine twigs still attached? And then your symptomatic trees, which might have veinal necrosis, marginal necrosis, things like that. Or are all these live oaks, in a long, big area, all exhibiting similar symptoms? And so if it's like 100-foot area, 200-foot area, and all of them are at the same point of, the issue visually, I think more drought. So you got to think about it, in that terms, pattern of mortality. And then what species are affected? So I went to a site recently where there was tall live oaks and then juniper underneath them. And the tall live oaks were pretty thin. There was a little bit of veinal necrosis happening, not a ton. But then down below, also the junipers are turning brown, all their needles. And then I look at the Texas persimmon and they're yellowing and turning brown. And so, looking at what other species are affected. And then if those aren't obvious, so especially like I get a lot of calls from San Antonio this year with the Spanish oaks, it might be their only tree in their yard. And so, can you take a sample? And I said, can you? Because in the summer, it's not ideal to take a sample for oak wilt because oak wilt is a heat sensitive fungus. And so trying to get a good sample from a tree when it's 105 outside and it's been 105, for 2 straight weeks, it's not likely that we're going to get a good sample. And so, now we're finally in this area of we can, sample again and kind of more rely on the results. So if we get a positive of oak wilt through the Texas Plant Disease Diagnostic Lab and we get a positive, that means they grew the fungus in a petri dish and it's present in the tree. If we get a negative, it might be because it's actually negative for oak wilt or we just didn't get it in the sample. And so sampling is always a great tool. You can send samples there yourself. I mentioned sampling quite a bit already, but it is available for anyone to send in a sample. I recommend Googling Texas Plant Disease Diagnostic Lab, and they have different steps on how to sample, how to ship it, all that stuff, depending on what you're trying to diagnose. Okay. And because I can't not talk about oak wilt ever, we're just gonna quickly go through some prevention, just as a reminder. So for pruning, peak beetle activity and fungal mat production occur in the spring. So the beetles are not really like, a lot of people like to blame the beetles. And I try to stand up for these beetles. They're not meaning to infect trees with oak wilt. They're native to the ecosystem. It's the Nitidulid beetles, and it's a whole family. So we have several species that live here. And they're attracted to anything sweet. That's why they're called sap-feeding beetles. And so fungal mats are the reproductive body of the oak wilt fungus. So some fungi grow mushrooms. Oak wilt is a fungal mat under the bark of an infected red oak, and the conditions just have to be right. So spring-like conditions can produce those fungal mats if the red oak is infected. The beetles are also more active in the spring. And so that's why pruning oaks in spring is the riskiest time to prune oak trees. Because they're flying around and they have fresh fungal spores on them. So they fly to those fungal mats, pick up those fungal spores unknowingly, fly off in search of another meal. And if you're pruning your oak, that smells really good to them, especially if there's a lot of cuts. And so that paint, so avoiding February through June, that's the risky time. And that's kind of shown with this graph here, their beetle activity. So you can see one of the lines is actually Kerrville and some other places in central Texas, but you can see after January, they really spike in their activity all the way through June. And so that's why those months are established. But you can see they're still active year round. So year round, paint your oak tree wounds. It can be regular old spray paint. It doesn't have to be the tree seal product. If you have that, that's great too. But I use like the cheapest spray paint at the hardware store. And immediately paint them. Because if you do a bunch of pruning and then you say, okay, now I'm going to pick up my spray paint can, you're going to probably miss some and forget where you've been. And it might be, 30 minutes, an hour later, and those beetles can't get there that quickly.
The question was, can the paint be petroleum based? For this?
I always get these questions about paints, and I'm like, I don't know paint with chemicals, but regular old spray paint. Does anyone have an answer for that? Petroleum-based paint.
Shouldn't make any difference.
Huh?
Shouldn't make any difference.
Shouldn't make any
Painting
difference.
is the important part.
Yes. painting is-
Covering the wound
Yes.
with something that the bugs are not gonna like.
Exactly. So the paint just deters them from smelling that wound and visiting. And so Dr. Apple makes a joke about, you could sit there for 48 hours and just swat the beetles away. That would work too. But so whatever paint you got is better than no paint for sure. Let's see if I missed anything here. Oh, I always get the question about, is it spread on tools? And so it's not been proven to spread on pruning tools, especially like chainsaws, because those heat up. And like I mentioned, it is a heat sensitive fungus. But it is a best practice because other things can spread on tools. So, tree to tree, if you're really diligent, disinfecting between trees, you can do 10% bleach with water or like Lysol spray, disinfectant spray. And if you're hiring a company, I'd recommend asking them, making sure that they've cleaned their tools before they start on your property. And then if any of y'all out there on Zoom or in here, if you pull up your camera, you can pull up that QR code. That's the pruning guidelines, pretty much everything I said summarized. Questions on oak wilt and pruning? Also, I could go on a whole pruning rant, but winter is the best time in general to prune trees anyway. So like November, December, January, those are really good times regardless of what species, because in the winter they're more dormant, they have more energy that they can expend to close those wounds that you've made. So trees don't heal, they seal, so they have to make new wood and growth to go around that wound. And so, in the spring they're using their energy for bud break, flowers, all that stuff. In the summer, they're trying to get through the heat of the summer. And then in the fall and winter, that's when less stuff is going on and they can dedicate more energy to sealing those wounds. And then it also works out with oak wilt. Okay. And then for firewood for oak wilt prevention, because the red oaks produce a fungal mat, you don't want, if you know that a red oak died of oak wilt, you don't want to use it as firewood. And that's because if you cut it up into logs, set it by your house, and there's a fungal mat intact still, beetles could be going back and forth until it dries out. Same with traveling with oak wilt. So that's how like places like Odessa and Lubbock got oak wilt, because someone probably from the hill country took firewood up there. Because these Netodula beetles are native, they were able to transfer those spores. So if you suspect your red oak, again, that's like Spanish oak, Shumard oak, blackjack oak, dyed of oak wilt, it's best to try to get rid of it as quickly as possible. We also have a cost share for that. You can contact me if you suspect, and we can go through all that stuff. But so you can burn it if we are, safe to burn, not in a burn ban. You can chip it up. So that's breaking up the host into small enough pieces where the fungal mat isn't going to be able to exist on those pieces. And it's a heated process as well. And then you can also bury it, and actually put something over it. In Kendall County, there's a brush site where they're trying to, I should ask them if they've been successful, but they're trying to process suspected infected red oaks like quickly, like same day if they can at that brush site. So that's a good resource if you live in Kendall County. And if you can't do any of those, like if this red oak is up on the side of a hill, you can girdle the tree. So cutting into the base all the way around the trunk, to cut into the live wood. And then even better if you can apply a herbicide just within that girdled cut to dry out and kill that tree quickly so that the fungal mat doesn't have a chance to grow. So that is another option. And then live oaks and white oaks cannot produce the fungal mat, the fruiting body of oak wilt. So it is okay to use those species as firewood, even if they died of oak wilt, but it's still recommended to use firewood locally to not spread other issues. Okay, back to drought. So what to do? Water slow and deep in absence of rainfall, even in the winter, if we're still in a drought, when it's above freezing. And like I said before, cold snaps can really help out the tree. Use mulch properly to increase soil moisture. So never stack the mulch on the trunk of the tree. It should always stop right before you get to the base of the tree. And then 2 to 3 inches of mulch around. And however far you want to go. So no limit there. But that can really reduce the soil temperature and increase the soil moisture. And then monitor for secondary issues and then wait. So, doing those twig tests, seeing if there's any obvious signs of issues. What not to do is fertilize. So we want the plant to just maintain what it has. If you fertilize, it's going to trigger it into a growth pattern and it just doesn't have the resources to do that. And then pruning live branches or damaging the tree. Again, because that expends a lot of energy for the tree to seal over those cuts and wounds. And then because the tree is already weakened by drought and you prune it, that can be an infection point for a disease or insect to come in. So we want to reduce that chance. And then don't remove the tree unless there's, evidence that there is an issue going on. So like the hypoxylon, bark falling off, branches, drooping and becoming brittle. Otherwise, if those, if you do your scratch test and it looks good, just wait. We're in El Nino, which means more rain this winter. So let's hoping for the best. Okay, other tree issues and some not really issues. So concerning ones to varying degrees, fungal conchs or like shelf fungus are these left 3 pictures. So we have chicken of the woods on the top and left, and then Ganoderma root rot at the bottom there. And so Ganoderma root rot, that is on like usually the base of the tree, and it's a big issue. It can turn the tree into like spongy mush, so it removes the structural integrity of the tree. That one is more common with more moisture, so haven't really seen any this year, I don't think. Chicken of the woods is a brown rot, which means it makes it more brittle and like blocky. So instead of spongy, it's more like brittle. So you have brown rots and white rots. And so if those are showing up on major parts of the tree, main branches, the trunk, those are concerning. Well, anywhere on the tree, they are concerning and they should require, closer look. Because if you're at this point where it's at a fruiting body, that means that fungus has been working in that tree for a while, which means it could be less structurally sound. You can sometimes get these though, like if you did cut a big limb off and there's that dead wood inside the cut, you can get, these shell fungus on just that part, the dead wood that is decaying, and that's less worrisome. And then we have Tabacia leaf spot, which is that picture with my thumb in it. And so leaf spots usually occur when there's more moisture. They're typically not a huge issue, but there's, you can correct it. So like if you have, I'm missing my words, sprinklers spraying up into the canopy of your tree, that's creating a more moist environment. We want to stop that if you're seeing leaf spots. I mean, you want to stop that anyway. We don't need water constantly spraying up into the canopy of our trees. You can rake the leaves so that we get rid of the inoculum of the fungus. But typically that's more of like a one season issue, one year. And then when they drop their leaves, it should be better next year. So not a huge issue, but you can do something to correct it. And then bacterial leaf spore, also called BLS for short. That's the bottom right picture on the first half. And that's typically seen, in this case, a red oak. And you can see that there's a yellow halo dividing the brown and the green part. So that's kind of one of those signals that it might be BLS. This is a disease that infects the xylem tissue, so the water tissues of the tree. And that way it's kind of like oak wilt, but it moves much slower in the tree. So it might lose like one limb this year. It might be okay the next year. It might lose another limb the next year. And it can be like propelled by drier, hotter years. And then herbicide damage is obviously a factor. Every year I usually get a couple of people that call and then they end up telling me that they've applied weed and feed right around their tree, which is on the label. It says do not put it anywhere near woody species, but it's like for your lawn, and there's always trees in a lawn. So people are always really surprised to hear when I show them on the fine print. So avoiding things like that. Planting issues. So again, that could be a whole nother talk, but not planting a tree in the right place, planting it too deep, not watering it enough, girdling roots, all those sorts of things. And then freeze damage, of course. So just major limbs breaking, those areas being open to infection, all that sorts of things with freeze. Anyone have a good freeze damage story?
Question on the chat says, do Mustang grapevines damage live oak and other trees?
Did y'all hear the question? I guess everyone in my Zoom can see it. I sure did. Okay. Does Mustang grape damage live oak trees?
And other trees.
And other trees. It can. And so vines are good for, wildlife species, but at a certain point, if they're covering the canopy of the tree and inhibiting that tree from photosynthesizing and getting sunlight, it can hurt a tree. As far as vines go, if you're at that point where, it is kind of taking over your tree, cutting the vine and then applying herbicide so that that vine doesn't resprout, and then letting the vine dry out in the tree and then pulling it out. If you try to pull out a live vine, it's wrapped around all those branches and twigs, and you're going to damage the tree in that process. Yes.
What about the Virginia creeper? Because doesn't it put in roots as it goes up?
Yeah. Again, it's like, to an extent, because some people.
Repeat the question.
Oh, sorry. I'm not learning. Specifically asking about Virginia creeper. And so, yeah, I mean, if it were on my tree, I would probably try to remove it. If it's on a tree that's like already declining and dying, and it's in a safe space where that tree, if it breaks a little bit or drops some limbs, it's okay. But then the native vines can, also be there. Okie dokie. Good questions. All right. Less worrisome issues, galls. That's the top picture, and then the top picture to the right. And so those are caused by synepid wasps, not the wasps that sting you that we think of, but smaller ones. And it's a really cool relationship. I recommend just like Googling videos of these different galls because the tree is like forming it for the insect. But I've noticed I'm mixing up this summer and last summer already. I think it was last summer, there was a lot more of those red galls on the underside of live oaks. But you also get like the brown ones. Like on the right, you can get the fuzzy, like light colored ones. So all different sorts of galls. They really don't hurt the tree. It's not cause for concern. Some years there's going to be more than others. Fall webworm, which is the middle picture there, really common on pecans. They kind of surround the ends of branches and webs. And so, something that you can do is, and it's not a huge issue because the deciduous tree is going to drop the leaves. You can rake it up to try to remove, the insects from the area. But if you just take like a broomstick and try to open that web up so natural predators can get in. But otherwise, it's really more of just an aesthetics issue. We have ball moss. Oh, bagworms. Bagworms is that bottom right picture. So again, it doesn't really impact the tree that much. Yes, you can spray like BT, but you have to do it early enough and they're nocturnal and they have to ingest it. And so it's usually just not worth the hassle. And then we have ball moss, which is that spiky picture down on the bottom left. So ball moss is an air plant. It's not rooting into the tree like mistletoe is. It's more common in the under canopy of trees. So specifically in live oaks, we see it a lot because they have like an umbrella shaped shape to them. Live oaks do. And so they naturally are self-pruning their lower branches to put on higher branches that reach the sunlight. And so those lower branches just become empty over time and bare. And the ball moss like that spot. They get filtered sunlight and some moisture under there. And so they are an air plant. So that's all they really need. But that's why you see them growing on fence lines and telephone wires. Yeah. And what was the specific question about ball moss? Just should you remove it?
Yes.
I mean, you can. I think it's mostly what I tell people is cut away the dead wood. That's going to get rid of the majority of the ball moss. But again, it's more of an aesthetics issue. If you're seeing it to a point where it is getting on top of the canopy and it's covering up, those upper branches, then you need to evaluate what else is going on with my tree that it's not healthy and producing leaves to take up its own space. Why is it bare enough for the ball moss to start, growing up onto those areas? And sometimes that's oak wilt or construction damage or, drought, what have you. But yeah, removing the dead wood is going to get rid of a majority of it. Some people, hire someone to pick off every single one. And if you do that a couple years in a row, sometimes it can last for a while. But if your neighbor has a ton of ball moss, it's going to come back. So, and then mistletoe, it is a problem because it is a parasite. It is rooting into the tree, but it also needs its host to stay alive, to live itself. And so, mistletoe is tough. You usually just have to prune off the branch that it's growing on to control it. Yes.
Before you change slides, I have 2 questions. First one is, could you tell us your opinion of organic foliar sprays that contain magnesium, carbonate, and kelp, etc.? So some questions.
Can you repeat the question?
Okay, I'm going to repeat it. Could you tell us your opinion of organic foliar sprays that contain magnesium, carbonate, and kelp, etc.?
I don't have an opinion on it because I don't know much about it. So,
Okay, but then second question.
but if you have something on it, please email me. I'd like to read more.
The response. Why keep mulch away from trunk?
Why keep the mulch away from the trunk or the base of the tree? So mulch is going to maintain moisture. And so if it's stacked on the trunk of the tree, we're having constant moisture on the trunk of the tree. And that area is critical for oxygen exchange and keeping that area relatively, dry, not constantly wet, because then you can get issues like the Ganoderma root rot. So we just don't want those issues to occur. Also, then you get, not that insects are bad or anything, but all that moisture, you can attract a lot of insects in that area too. Anything else? Okay, cool. Any questions from y'all? I have no idea how I'm doing on time. All right. That's it.
Perfect.
Any questions, anything y'all are seeing on your own trees? Yes.
Had some blackjacks that had the fungus where the bark came off and started
Hypoxylon, yeah.
hypoxylon. Yeah, it took a couple of years, but I didn't know what it was. Well, I didn't notice it because it was back end until like,
But they're dead.
yeah, they're dead.
You might want to repeat that question.
He just said he had some blackjack oaks with hypoxylon, but he didn't notice it for a couple of years because they were in the back, and,
Yeah,
but they are dead now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
so really huge.
Yes.
So how can live oaks or some other trees that have this done too, that are concreted over, except a
Yeah.
small hole,
Mhm.
how do they live? Just
So
seems
the-
like enough water cannot be.
The question was, how do live oaks that are like surrounded in concrete, how do they live? And yeah, not well, usually. There's a big tree in Medina on that main street. Do y'all know which one I'm talking about? And it's hanging over. And I was called out to it because it was suspected to have oak wilt. And, you know, my advice was to water the back area where it's not covered in road, you know, and cement and asphalt. So, you know, their roots they extend far, specifically live oaks, you know, their roots go 2 to 3 times the height. And so hopefully they are they are reaching out to areas that can get some good water infiltration.
Okay, one last question from Zoom audience. My post oak droops all the way to the ground. Can this invite insects to cause damage to it?
The post oak droops all the way to the ground. Can that invite insects to it?
Do damage?
I'm curious what that means.
Does that mean dangling on the ground so insects get on the branches and stuff like that?
Oh, for the insects coming up. Okay, I'm thinking like if it's drooping, is it going to break? And that point
Yeah.
I think of as an infection point. I mean, no, I wouldn't say that it would cause more insects to travel up it, because I mean, the trunks are, you know, they could travel up the trunk if they wanted to as well. That's interesting. I'm curious if this is like a mature post oak, if it's a young post oak. Why is it drooping?
Very mature.
Very mature. Interesting. That must be like these lower branches that,
So,
okay.
we have just let it grow the way it wants to go.
Let it grow the way it wants to go. Yeah, I edited this from a couple of different PowerPoints. And one thing I always say is, you know, when I talk about that decline spiral is also, you know, that tree, we're talking about mature trees, you know, natively growing, that has been there long before we were in the picture. And so when we do too much to it, you know, that can cause stress. I get a lot of people telling me, oh, I, you know, spent this much money pruning all my trees. And then I look at the trees and I'm like, oh, they're over pruned, you know, which that's stressful for the tree too. So a lot of the times, yeah, it is best to just let it be. But then we get these crazy things like the winter storm and this 2-year drought. So sometimes we definitely can help.
That's it.
Last question.
Yeah.
Your professor's name was Dr. Apple?
Dr. Applehead, heard of him?
Guess that's a perfect name for a tree.
I know, yeah, good name for a tree person, yeah. He studied a ton. He's the main researcher of wilt in Texas. He is partially retired now, just recently, and lives in the hill country now. So he moved from College Station. I was going to add something. Oh, just that we had a coworker, his name was Burl. He's retired. But it's like, man, all these cool tree names, yeah.
But apple is not spelled A-P-P-L-E.
It's APPEL, yeah.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Get my O's and my E's.
Is that in the photo?
Who knows?
By Burnham.
Other guesses? It has pink bark.
Oh.
Madrone, yeah, Texas Madrone.
Question when
Yes, it is Madrone, Texas Madrone. That was in the Guadalupe Mountains.
Any chance of saving a tree with oak wilt or decline?
Any chance of saving a tree with oak wilt or decline? Well, which one? Because they're different.
Either one.
What's
So-
the latest?
So, I know, and I could go all into oak wilt. I know somebody all sat through a whole hour of just oak wilt before, so I didn't want to get too in the weeds, but for oak wilt, prevention to just prevent new infection centers, following those guidelines, painting your cuts, painting, if we do have a storm where you lose a bunch of limbs, if you can go out the next day and cut it back to a proper spot and then paint that, that's ideal. That's not always at all possible for most people with more than just a tree. But there's also fungicides to inject trees. So if you're in an area with an advancing oak wilt center and you know it's coming towards your trees, you can preventatively treat those with a fungicide. And then there's also trenching, where you cut the roots, kind of close it off to try to stop that root spread. And so it stops it from going to, the next trees. Those are the main ways. Planting a diversity of trees, so the impact of oak wilt, is lessened by the fact that you have other different species growing and getting established. And then oak decline, that's when we go back into, just maintaining tree health, tree vigor. For declines in Texas, specifically, we have what's called rapid decline of post oaks in Texas. And that's because post oaks particularly can go through decline very quickly. And AgriLife has an informational flyer on that. And so, not disturbing the roots specifically with post oaks are really sensitive with their roots. So, construction damage, staying very far away from post oaks. So things like that. Yes.
Has trenching been effective?
Has trenching been effective? Yes. So when we cost share trenches, that means it goes completely around the oak wilt center. And so we go out and randomly evaluate those, 3, 5, 10 years later, whatever, is randomized that time. And it is proven, or like those evaluations show that it's about 70 to 75% effective, which means when we went out and evaluated, the disease had not crossed the other side of the trench. So it's still inside the trench. If you have a huge trench, like thousands of feet, and it breaks out in one spot, that's considered a failure in our evaluations. So that 70 to 74% is considering the whole perimeter of the trench. But it has to be placed correctly. It has to cut all, and the goal is to cut all the roots between the diseased and the healthy, and you have to get 100 feet away from your diseased tree to get ahead of the fungus in the roots. So all of those things have to line up to get a good holding trench. Awesome. Thanks for having me.